Greetings from Dallas Willard Ministries. If you are viewing our videos, I'm assuming you are serious about knowing more about Jesus Christ and living in His kingdom. With that in mind, you might want to check out our Facebook page, School of Kingdom Living. It's a 2-year program that will change your life. I know that's an overused phrase, but we guarantee it. And now in part 5, your interest is going to be gripped by Dallas's discussion of human reason, where it has gone wrong, and how it can be redeemed.
Thank you very much, and it's good to see you again. And we're talking in this series about knowledge of Christ in the contemporary world. And the issue underlying the whole series is this issue of knowledge and what it is. So we need perhaps to be reminded that knowledge means an interactive relationship. And that's true not just in the case of Jesus Christ, it's really true in relationship to everything. And that's why, for example, if you have a course of information on something, you always need a practical component to put you in touch with it. And you can have people lecture you on even mathematics, which is about as abstract as knowledge gets, as long as you want. But then it really comes home when you go to the board. And then you have to figure it out, and you have to work with it. And it's that kind of interaction with the subject matter that means real knowledge. True of everything from the alphabet on up. I mean, you know the alphabet. How did you learn the alphabet? Well, you all probably remember how you learned the alphabet. You remember that? It's an interesting part of life, isn't it? And you learn how to make those letters. See, that's practice. You're intimately interacting with the alphabet when you do that. And then when you grow up and you talk and link and write, you're still doing the same thing. It's just a little... People often say to me, you know, they write about writing books. Well, writing books just becomes a habit. And once you get into it, it's hard to stop. But that's because of the intricate involvement with it, you see. And then it takes a life on, carries on really very much of its own. Knowledge is like that. What we call head knowledge probably isn't even knowledge. It's the capacity to recite. And our school system and our educational system is so focused on that. Now, of course, we don't recite like we used to. Recite used to mean stand and deliver, to take the name of the movie, if you remember that movie. Stand and deliver. Now you recite on tests. That's the same thing. I often joke with my students after they hand in their test, do you believe what you wrote? And they all look at me quizzically and kind of laugh, because they know that they don't have to believe what they write. They just have to know which of the answers are the right answers. And needless to say, they don't know what they wrote either. They just know that these are the things you say. That affects our religion a lot. And you know, some people I think often suspect that they're going to have an examination in heaven, or to get into heaven, or something of that sort. And the question, will they know the right answers? But it really isn't like that. Knowledge is interactive relationship. It's an awareness of things on the basis of experience and thought. So when we talk about knowledge of Christ in the current world, we have a lot to overcome, really. A lot of misunderstandings about what knowledge is. And we have to get away from this idea that it is kind of recitation. You know. And it's really interacting with the subject matter. And then to know a subject matter is to be able to represent it, think about it, work with it as it is on the basis of appropriate thought and experience. And that will always involve truth. And so truth becomes a really big deal. So now in the warfare we live in as human beings, and if you don't know we're in a war, check the morning newspaper, and you'll see I'm not referring to Iraq, I'm referring to the human condition, which is a constant warfare. The warfare we're in, there's a constant battle between truth and falsity, things that pose as knowledge but aren't, and things that are real knowledge. And that's because our action in our life runs on our beliefs. And we try to get to knowledge because knowledge will give us secure beliefs. The problem is with mere belief is it's not stable. And you remember James talks about that, doesn't he? Unstable, the double-minded person is unstable in all their ways, he says. Now, you see the connection there? Because when you have double-mindedness, it affects all your ways. Right? Jesus used a similar teaching. Remember, he said the light of the body is the eye. And if the eye is clear, then the whole body is full of light. If the eye is not clear, the body is in real trouble, isn't it? You see how all that works? And it's so important, I think, to understand that the people who wrote the Bible were deeply thoughtful people who really understood important stuff and were rooted in real life. And because of that, they give us knowledge that we can take and then put it into practice and use our reasoning on it and come to the place to where we have a firm grasp of the truths that are essential to living and to living well. So all those questions now that we brought up about what is reality, who is well off, what is the good life, who is a good person, see, all of that then rests, the answers to those rests upon the teaching that we receive and what we learn by experience and what we think out, and so that's the way things go. Now, there's another side to this, which is a side that's set on leading us to believe what is false. And I wanted to begin this morning just by looking at Paul's language in 2 Corinthians 10. It's very familiar. You may not want to bother to look at it. Maybe just jot it down, 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5. Paul was very conscious of the kind of problem about knowledge, false knowledge, belief, and so very conscious of what we talked about last night, especially at the end about there being a battle and how Satan works through ideas. And if you can get the ideas set right, he can sort of take a nap. And evil will just run on its own. And it will run in terms of ideas and the associated images and patterns of reason and feeling that governs the will of human beings. And when you see a situation where someone is doing some terrible thing, whether it's Saddam Hussein or whoever your favorite bad guy is, or just some pathetic individual that winds up in the newspaper because of something terrible that they did, back of that will always lie a set of ideas and images. And that is the ultimate control system. Now listen to what Paul says here. Verse 3 of 2 Corinthians 10 and following. For though we walk in the flesh, that's where we live. Walk always refers to living. We walk in the flesh. We do not war in terms of the flesh. Your translation may ask according to, it's the Greek term kata, which I think is most helpfully read in many of Paul's passages as in terms of. We don't war, we don't carry out the battle we're in terms of our natural abilities. And that's what flesh means, is our natural abilities. And remember that flesh is not inherently bad. It only becomes bad when you trust it. And when it serves the Spirit, then flesh is good, it's God's creation, and it's designed for an eternal destiny even that is very great. So we walk in the flesh, that's where we live. So we're surrounded by natural abilities, and nearly everything that we do involves our natural abilities. We do not war in terms of the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh. And again, we need to translate it because we have such a hard time keeping that clear. The weapons of our warfare are not natural human abilities, no matter how well refined. They're not natural human abilities. And the temptation to revert to those is something we have to constantly deal with. And we put our trust in them, as we said last night from Romans 8, the mind of the flesh is death. There's no more to it than that. The natural abilities are limited. And he says, but divinely powerful for the destruction of strongholds or fortresses. And there are places that are very resistant to truth, very resistant to trust. And where we're pointing our finger mostly in this discussion is in the idea system that dominates in our culture. We don't want to be mean and unpleasant about it, but we do have to recognize that there are sources of authority in our culture that are opposed to God. And they're there, and they work constantly. So that's what he's talking about. We are destroying speculations. And I'd like you, especially this morning, to note that word speculation, because we're going to be talking mainly about reason. And speculation is a matter of getting a larger view. We talk about a spectacle. And one thing a spectacle cannot be is small. Did you know that? A spectacle cannot be small. It has to be big. It involves some sort of spread. And the Greek term theoria is a term that refers to an expansive view of things, encompassing, taking in. And that naturally tends towards what we've called worldview, which is the overall orientation of our life that expresses itself usually without our thinking about it, because it's just embedded in our whole being. Speculations. We are destroying speculations. Isn't that an interesting phrase? We're destroying speculations. Well, that's where the fortresses are. And speculations are wide-ranging views that may or may not be true. And they serve other purposes than truth. We're destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. Now, see, that's what we've been talking about. Knowledge of Christ in the contemporary world has a set of speculations that are raised up against knowledge of God. And a lot of that has to do with the very interpretation of what knowledge is. You remember that last night we talked about the question, who gets to determine what knowledge is? And in general, today, the assumption is the Bible does not. The Bible is not knowledge, that Jesus himself is not a very intelligent person and isn't a source of knowledge. He's very nice, but not very smart. Almost no one will say, well, he's not a nice man. I mean, you have to really have a profound education to get to that point. Very few people make it. But very few people also understand that Jesus is the most intelligent person who ever lived. He is. Right? So he really knows, am I blowing up? He really knows the truth that will guide us in life. And so we come to him and we approach that. We approach him in terms of knowledge. What? The knowledge of God. You remember one of the things that he said when he came was, forget everything you think you know about God. And that's a big offload, isn't it? All the things we know that ain't so about God. And Jesus was very conscious that the deepest problems in our knowledge has to do with God and misinformation or a lack of knowledge about God. And so he addresses that, and Paul addresses that. When Paul goes out in the world, As we again read last night, the rulers of this world did not understand that he was the Prince of Glory and that he really knew what he was talking about, and they had their own ideas which belonged to this age, which is passing away, and they crucified him because of that. And you and I might experience something close to crucifixion today for the same reason, and many people in the world do experience persecution and death because of it. Okay. So we're destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Now that's the center, that's the source of our life, is our thoughts. The gospel comes in the form of a thought. God so loved the world that he gave his own, that's a thought. Right? Now, it comes to us with the administration of the Spirit of God and impacts our lives, and if we then allow our will to relent and accept that, then we are on the path to an ever fuller knowledge of God in the sense of interactive relationship. If we can't accept that, then we are left to ourselves, and the highest object that we can find to devote ourselves to will be us. And then everything else will be out of orientation, out of sync, because that we're taking as the ultimate point of reference, namely ourselves. That's what happened, of course, in the garden. And now once that happens, then we are left to our reason. And we want to talk about reason at some lengths in this hour. Let's start with this statement. Reason is the God-given power of human beings to see connections and incorporate them in mechanisms to extend that power to indefinite lengths. And we can really appreciate this today when we know about computers. See, mathematics develops very slowly, but it began maybe around the time of Abraham or even before. It was very crude, but it was a discovery of reason that enabled people, first of all, to just keep track of their commercial accounts. So the Sumerian clay tablets that nearly everyone learns about in school, those were primarily account ledgers, government or business. But you see, unless you have some kind of mechanism, you can't keep the connections before you, because the truth is, our mind, like our will, is in itself very weak and very small. And anyone who counts just on their mental powers alone without help from language, symbolism, or nowadays computers is, of course, pretty quickly in trouble. And so reason now is fundamental to dealing with life. It is not a bad thing. Let's say at the outset, there is no such thing as a conflict between faith and reason. So let's say that again, because it's often said, you know, that there's a conflict between faith and reason. There is no such thing as a conflict between faith and reason. The conflicts come when reason is not used rightly. When you misuse reason, you're not only going to have conflicts with faith, you're going to run into the wall, probably. Reason is something that can be misused, but when it is rightly used, it never conflicts with faith. And now I'm going to go back and remind you that faith, in biblical terminology, is not opposed to knowledge. It's opposed to sight. And actually, faith is the instrument, if you wish, the organ of the human self that allows you to find appropriate premises beyond the visible world from which reason can then work to enable us to apprehend more and more comprehensive truth. I mean, just God himself. I mean, you have to really think about God if you're going to get anywhere with him. And thinking wrongly about him can tie you in knots. and does that regularly. And as I said last time, Satan is very much at work in this area. He wants to give us false ideas, which when we begin to reason with them, will defeat us and lead us astray. So now, the verse that I have here on the page from Romans 12 is put in terms of reason. I urge you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, well-pleasing to God, which is the rational thing to do. Now, see that you will only do that if you have God in the right place, because if you don't have God in the right place, your body will be in God's place, which is what we have in our society today by and large, and that's one reason why we live in a sensualistic society. Not a new thing. The story in Romans 1 is a story about the descent into a sensualistic society where feeling governs, and the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life are what make up the social system. See, that's, now, once you have God in the right place, then you see the reasonable thing to do is to submit your body as a living sacrifice. That is, something given to God. It's alive, has a life of its own, and that life is caught up in the life of God. And you'll notice here how that's to be done. Don't be conformed to this age. That means don't be conformed to the way of thinking, which is, if you wish, normal in this age, and that means the age we're living in too. But be transformed by the renovation of your mind. Now, I think all of us here in this group are familiar with that teaching, but we do need to think about what that would really mean to have a renovated mind. And it would mean that it would be a mind occupied with truth and one that thinks straight, thinks correctly, and is not governed by false images, but is in control so that that mind, which the will has to work from, see, your will has to work from your mind. And again, that's why Satan is so busy about ideas. Because if when you're in a situation and the only thing you can think to do is something wrong, you'll do that. And so what are the alternatives? Well, that only comes by a renewed mind. Now, where the primary source of the renewed mind is the Bible. And that's why the last talk was about the Bible, was we wanted to set that up and make sure about it. And we tried to emphasize that how you use the Bible is with humility and openness. There's much more that can be said about that, but that's the main thing. Use it, first of all, but then use it with humility and openness and be teachable, and that will be a primary instrument in the renewal of your mind. And when your mind is renewed, you will be able to prove the will of God. Now, see, that doesn't come first. You don't first prove the will of God. You first give your body a living sacrifice. And then, through the transformation of the mind, you come to the place to where you can verify, you can prove what God's will is. And God's will is, of course, expressed in the law. It's expressed in the teachings of Jesus. It's expressed in his example. It's expressed in the letters that are written by Paul and John and the others, Peter. So that's the will of God, but you prove it in life, and that's where it becomes knowledge. So, for example, suppose someone take a verse out of Paul where he says, lay aside anger. Well, you have to prove that, don't you? A lot of people don't believe that. And now Paul just rather naturally says, now lay aside anger and wrath, malice, blasphemy, false talking, seeing you put off the old man with his deeds. Ooh, wait a minute. Okay, I must be true because Paul said it. It's in the Bible. But wait a moment, I haven't proved it yet. How do I prove it? I prove it by thoughtfully putting it into practice and finding out how to lay aside anger. I have to test things out. Like, for example, many people honestly believe they could not live without anger. And they have thoughts like, for example, if you're not angry, you can't stand up for justice. And we now have a society that is sick with battles over justice because it's intermingled with anger. So you have to find, for example, that everything you can do with anger, you can do better without it. Not being angry doesn't make you some kind of pushover, some sort of Casper milk toast, as we used to say. Does anyone know Casper milk toast anymore? We used to say Casper milk toast, and you know, milk toast is pretty malleable, shall we say. But no, actually, you don't have to be angry to be firm. I was counseling a couple years ago, and they taught me such an interesting lesson because they're having trouble with their son. And after a while I said, well, why don't you try punishing him when you're not angry? And they said, what? Punish him in cold blood? Now see, that's interesting, because if you're in hot blood, it seems like you're justified in what you're doing. You know, people talk about righteous indignation. I've never seen any unrighteous indignation. All the indignation I've ever seen has been righteous in the person who was caught up in it. And check it out yourself. When you're angry, do you ever feel, oh, I'm not justified? No, in the moment of anger, you always feel justified. So you see, you learn, that's what's called proving the will of God. And we have to use reason to do that. Now, the function of reason is to enable us to fulfill the creation responsibility of Genesis 1:26, and we need to look at that. And you'll see that we were given a real big job. When God made us and put us upon the earth, His image on us was, in fact, dominion or rule. In verse 26 of Genesis 1, He says, then God said, let us make man, human beings, in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Now I ask you, isn't that what we do? We rule over the fish. Right? We rule over the trees. We rule over Now the trees and the fish are in real trouble because we're trying to run our kingdom instead of God's kingdom. But rule does not mean do what you want to. It means be responsible for. Now, if we have the responsibility for the fish, there's a lot of fish, aren't there? And so we need this ability to carry out the creation responsibility. See, the human being is fundamentally creative will. And that happens immediately. A little child comes into the world. If you saw that beautiful little creature that came in here and gave me a hug. Now, when she could almost do nothing else, she would want to give you something. She was eating a cracker and you walked up, she'd like for you to give it back too, but see, it's just built into us. It's built into us. We want to do, to give, to create. And so a little child makes things. And we go through life making stuff. We want to make stuff. That's very deep. That's the image of God in human beings, is to want to make good things. That's what it, and now you test out the stuff I say to you, okay? You take it, you observe life and read your scriptures and think about it and see if this isn't true. Because really one of the problems we need to talk about, if we can today, is the problem that is posed by the fact that people can't figure out what human beings are for. And this is another one of the great fruits of intellectual development in the Western world. What are human beings for? Well, this is what they're for. They're to be responsible for the world around them for good. And that is the basis of morality in the nature of the human being. So the good person is the one who is responsible. Now, we run into all kinds of problems when we turn away from God and we try to use our reason on our own. But the problem is not with reason. The problem is with the use of reason and the misuse of reason. And that runs into problems like the Tower of Babel. I mentioned here Genesis 11:6. Wonderful words. God, looking at people putting up the Tower of Babel, says, "Now nothing which they propose to do will be impossible to them." And that, in a word, is what modernity means, is that we can change anything. So there's DNA, change it. Right? Brain chemistry, change it. Right? Can we clone people? Let's do it. And because there's no overriding check on it. If the human being is supreme, then what the human being takes it upon their head to do, let's do it. Right? So what did the guy say? Why did he climb El Capitan? Well, it was there. Now, we use that as a joke, but it's no joke. It's no joke. What that man was saying, well, because it challenged my will. See, that's the human way. That's the Frank Sinatra version, or the Burger King version. Have it my way. Right? That's the Burger King version of human life. Or the Frank Sinatra version. Frank has a better song, though the theology is equally bad. I did it my way. So here's some of the problems with reason. Reason has to have starting points. You can't deal with connections until you got something to connect. And so starting points, we would call these premises in logic, starting points. And if you start at the wrong point, no matter how furiously you reason, you're in trouble. And in fact, the best thing you can do is to slow your reasoning down. That way you'll postpone your trouble. And so this is really difficult. The book I mentioned last time, Voltaire's Bastards, is a story about mistaken starting points, among other things. Voltaire, the reason we mention Voltaire is because Voltaire is the one he's paradigmatically thought of as the rationalist. That is, the person who uses reason. And he, of course, is one who brought much of this idea that there's an inherent conflict between faith and reason into vogue. Second problem, keeping the chain of corrections right. You have to make sure that the connections are all there and that they link up in the way that they do. Now, here's a real tragedy, because you see, one of the things that has disappeared from education in our day is logic. You don't teach logic. You teach method. And the method is the accepted procedure in the discipline. But that isn't necessarily logic. Talked a little bit about judicial logic last time, and about the reasoning of judges. And what dominates is accepted procedure in the legal profession. But legal reasoning is not necessarily logical, because it has different objectives. For example, the object of the legal system, in part, is to get a decision. And that becomes an overriding consideration, and you wind up defining justice as due process. That's an interesting idea. Due process is not necessarily just in any other sense than that's what came out of the end of the legal pipe. As you see, if you don't have a rigorous sense of logic and you're able to follow it, we don't teach that anymore. And that goes into what we were talking about earlier, about how Today, the standard of reasoning is not how you reason, not your argument, but the conclusion you come to. If the conclusion is not right, the reasoning must be wrong. But that's because they have no sense of logic here. Then desire gets in the mix. And desire will not necessarily like the starting point. I mean, if the starting point has to be, God is God, I'm not, well, that can be disappointing. I might not want to start there. Because that comes to me and says, now, you know, what you want isn't exactly the ultimate issue. In fact, might be a real problematic one. So desire, and then pride and willfulness. See, these are things that cause reason to go wrong and cause us to misuse reason. Pride is a tremendous problem because it stands in opposition to humility of mind. And there's probably nothing more necessary to loving relationships than humility of mind. You ever notice a child, if you tell them something they didn't know, they normally will say, I know. Did you ever notice that? I know. I knew that. See? That's very deeply rooted in human beings. Not to know is an insult to our pride. And children feel it inherently. They feel it very, very early age. And of course, knowledge is so important too. I mean, I don't mean to downplay it. It's very important. People who have near-death experiences, when they come through them and come back, they nearly always say that two things I have not done justice to in my life, and I'm going to now. And one is knowledge, and the other is love. Isn't that interesting? That's just a little empirical tidbit there to think about. But see, if these things get in the way, then knowledge puffs up. And it's only love with knowledge. Now, love doesn't exclude knowledge. In fact, love requires knowledge. Because love means the will for the good of the object. Now, in order to love, I have to have knowledge to know what is for the good of the object, don't I? So love naturally requires knowledge. The problem is that knowledge can function independently of love, and when it is guided with those things, then it causes real problems. So then reason is limited by the necessity of having premises to work with, and we have to have the right ones, we have the wrong ones, that we're off in the wrong direction. It is troubled by the difficulty of correctness in inference, and it is troubled by the willingness, the fact that willingness to know truth contradicts our desires. The bitterness of truth is that it is utterly unyielding to desire. You cannot change what is true because you don't want it. All you can do is deny it. And so that's why we say sometimes that you shall know the truth and the truth shall make you flee. Yeah? And if you're fleeing from truth, then reason will become an instrument for the wrong thing. And so that's how we get in such trouble with reason, is we're really not honest with the truth in the first place, and then we start reasoning, and our reasoning becomes something else that we have another word for. Our reasoning becomes rationalization. And rationalization means you're using reason to justify something that is unjustifiable. I've given some comments here from John Wesley's sermon on the case of reason considered. And for just your future reference, I really encourage you to read this sermon. Wesley has a very balanced view in which he tells you how great reason is. And then he lists some things that cause problems, that people try to force reason where it can't. He mentions that reason cannot give a clear and satisfactory evidence of the invisible world. Now, we've talked about it giving an evidence, but you see, it doesn't give you enough. It gives you enough to make you uneasy if you're smart. And you will realize that, as the scripture says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but it's not the end of wisdom. Right? It's not the end, it's the beginning. It's where you start. You start to get smart at the point where you realize God has a perspective on me. He has something in mind for me. I'd better pay attention to this. See, that's the point at which you begin to get smart. That's like, for example, now that's a correct starting point. And if you will reason from that starting point and let your experience and your reasoning grow, then you will come out at an understanding of God that is very solid. Wesley says, it can't produce hope of life eternal and everlasting. It can't. This is one of the things that comes from the teaching of Jesus. We'll be talking about it next time or the time after. But one of the things that comes from the teaching of Jesus is the assurance, the knowledge of life beyond what we call death. And reason can't do that on its own. A human struggle with that is unceasing and unsuccessful. Reason cannot produce love of God, love of neighbor, can't produce virtue, can't produce happiness by itself. Now, these inabilities are not just due to the nature of reason. I want to go back and emphasize that. Reason itself is a good thing. You just don't want to use it for everything. You don't use a dining fork to pick your teeth, I hope. But dining forks are perfectly fine. That's not a problem with the dining fork. That's a problem with the use you're making of it. And so we have to understand that about reason. Now, education, of course, is the field where we now supposedly receive knowledge about how to live. And what we have to say is very simple. Education as a strictly human enterprise cannot succeed. And it cannot succeed because it cannot get the correct starting points. Right. Now, the tragedy of Western culture is going to be that the people who knew the truth about God and human life threw it away and turned to an education without God. And that's, if there's a future in which history will be written, that will be one of the greatest tragedies. And people will see that the incredible miseries of the 20th century, and who knows about the 21st, are due to that one fact. And so nationalism, racism, genocide, all of those things are based in a denial and an ignorance of the truth about God and about human beings that is contained in the Scriptures. And we are now in a situation in this country where you cannot find a basis for equal rights. They're proposed simply as something that is founded on law, but then, of course, there's no foundation for law. And the things that we hold dear ethically and culturally all derive from the Christian tradition, and now they stand without a foundation. And you have to give the devil his due, and poor Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche is often dumped on, and perhaps he should be for some reasons, but you have to give him credit for understanding what was happening and for knowing that the change that had come was going to have incredibly disastrous consequences. And of course he had no way at all to provide an alternative foundation, but you have to give him credit. See, we are now skating on thin ice, and the ice is getting thinner. And it's getting thinner not just because it's getting unchristian itself. No, that unchristian isn't the adequate word. It's getting thinner because it has departed from the knowledge of God and the human soul. That knowledge is now lost to education. And I don't want to try to take time to go into that any further, except to say primary points about this have to do with things like, what are human beings for? And there is no teaching based in knowledge that is conveyed through our educational system as to what human beings are for. And the idea that lies back of this is that there is not a human nature. There's no human nature. See, all of this is necessary in order that freedom should be exalted. Freedom and pleasure are exalted, and when you exalt those, then you have to set aside nature. And so you hear the slogans like, well, all the differences of race and gender and so forth that we hear constantly about, these are constructions. They're not nature. And in themselves, there is no such thing as human nature. And for all you would know, they would think maybe a human being could be a Brussels sprout or a squirrel or something like that. Now, of course, the Christian tradition, the destiny of man is to love God, to know God, and enjoy Him forever. And in that context, to love and serve. Another thing that's wrong, of course, is that you can't acknowledge sin. Today, educators are like farmers who can't acknowledge bugs and weeds. And so all they know to do is pour on more fertilizer, makes the weeds grow better and the bugs happier. Right? They say, well, you know, there are bugs. Oh, okay. Well, there are weeds. Well, maybe we'd better do something about those. But see, we cannot acknowledge sin. And that's the general thing that lies back with the problem of evil. And other things that we could mention are, well, things like the disappearance of logic from education, and also the disappearance of any sensible moral theory in education. So what we have to say is, I think, put very simply, education is the answer. The question is which one? Which education? Education, if you mean coming to know the truth and living in the truth, that's the answer. But if you mean by education a form of teaching that has no basis in the spiritual nature of God and man and the reality of the moral law and the purpose of human life founded in that, then education is not the answer. Education will simply produce more clever sinners. And you will see that it doesn't help people. So, for example, what our situation today in this culture is that depression is epidemic. And in fact, now the last thing that came out of the JAMA, or whatever the journal is, the Journal of the American Medical Association, was worldwide, it is the leading cause of illness, depression. Where does depression come from? Answer: hopelessness. Hopelessness. And then there's a whole framework of emotions that go with that. And you say, well, it's a brain condition. Sure, it's a brain condition. If you get hopeless, it will affect your brain. And then your brain will fit into the cycle, and you'll have problems getting it regularized because, you know, the brain is a big gland. It's a chemical factory. And the primary interface between the human soul and the body is the glandular system. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do what you can for your brain to help it get back on a happy path. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But we're not going to solve the problem just by manipulating the brain. The real problem has to do with the sense of hopelessness that is now people are burdened with almost, well, from their youth. If you just look at the billboards that have to do with things like avoiding pregnancy and so on, you think about how a child feels when they look at that. And they're raised in a world in which they're constantly told there are too many people. There's no place for them. See, that's then the foundation for depression begins to step up. So now let's just say that offering our bodies as a living sacrifice to God, that is the key. We have to have the knowledge of God to do that. And we begin to use our reason rightly when we see things in the light of God and the spiritual nature of the person. We have to have confidence in God. And we have to get that through Jesus Christ. We have to live in the truth, and the truth sets us apart. As Jesus prayed once again in John 17, sanctify them by thy truth. See, truth is what sets people apart. Because when they have the truth, they live in a different way. And they have a different source of life. The interaction between them and God brings the necessary truth and light into them, and the energy is provided from the source of life in God himself. And then we learn how to do that. And we find every means to maximize the life of Jesus in ourselves and in the life of others. And when we do that, we lead a reasonable life. Come now, let us reason together, God says. Reason in the light of faith, the knowledge that we have by our understanding of God gives us what we need to lead a reasonable life. Thank you.